Hi. Why do I do this instead of Sandy? Well, because she's not here, but I was at university with Sandy with a couple of other people here. We did the EDAC course at Warwick, which included enjoying time at CAT. In my year, we surveyed the river it was a beautiful summer. We spent a lovely time surveying the river to see how much head for the railway thing. And then I worked for her, doing air tightness testing, which is what I do, what I've always done, which for more than 30 years, really. So anyway, shelter. Looking, going back, Sandy sent me her notes, so I've gone through those and looking at the book. It's kind of like, oh yeah, it's a really kind of, well, the term that occurs to me is parochial. It's a very limited box definition of shelter. And my inclination will be to expand it since we're all here, but hey, I'm a pain in the arse like that. So it talks about organisation. How do you organise your living, your housing? It talks about your state of mind, living lightly on the earth. That's jumped over huge bits, especially when you think that their organisation is about tenant control. It's like, it doesn't talk really about the mass market in construction, the volume house builders who carry on building rubbish. Let's be clear. Volume house builders build rubbish, and they'll carry on doing it as long as you let them. I'm fortunate, I basically work in the passive house sector. And even in the passive house sector, we have problems. I have 165 passive house dwellings on my books that are failing, and some of them will fail forever, to achieve passive house, which is of the order of 10% of the current passive houses in the UK this year. Now, some of these are projects going on over 3 years, so it's not as bad as that. We reckon about 5% fail to achieve passive house, and that's the good end of the market. Right, that's the good end. I would say that volume house builders, compared to when radical technology came out, they've got worse. They deliver a poorer service, a poorer quality. We'll be lucky if a lot of the houses built since radical technology came out are still here in 25 years. Certainly 50 years. There's a whole heap of rubbish out there that needs fixing. And refurbishment. What happens in refurbishment? Some of you will have heard of the Centre of Refurbishment Excellence up in Stoke-on-Trent. What happened? It got shut down. Great. I just finished their course, which even that wasn't that demanding, but it looks at a whole different level of refurbishment. But we just finished it, and then the organisation gets sabotaged, basically, and shut down. And, in terms of shelter, in terms of refurbishing the existing stock, which of course is most of what we've got to deal with. It's not new build. New build we can do well. We don't, but we can. It's refurbishment. And refurbishment that avoids creating health problems, mold problems, and creates problems with dwellings that are not going to be fit for purpose in 5, 10, 15 years' time. Anyway. Radical technology talks about vernacular building, going back to what's been built for decades. Straw bale building, cob building, flint building, depending on where you are in the country. Which, I'm a fan of it, although I've worked on various straw bale projects in particular, including Anthony's, which is a really nice house. But, it's got to be fit for purpose. And of course, the other thing, all these grand design projects, I work on them and I laugh at them because it's a passive house. It's not a passive house unless you've got 20 people living in this house. You can't have a house that's 200 square metre floor area and call it a passive house. It's nonsense. I used to joke with people, I used to annoy them. I say, let the refugee officer know there's lots of space in this house. Which, of course, again, if you take out the border box, we have the box of Northern Europe. What about the people in Africa? What about the whole refugee crisis now? Because, if we can't stop global warming, and that's what it looks like, what happens when Africa's at 40 degrees? Why would you stay in Africa? I wouldn't stay in Africa at 40 degrees. I'd say, come on, you guys made it. I'm coming to stay with you. I want your spare bedroom, or whatever it is. So, there you go. Anyway, so we have our gang of three. David, Stefan, Pat. Pat I've worked with on various buildings around McConfleth, doing airtightness testing, and we've usually got an okay, but I'm sure I've annoyed him at times.
Sorry, no.
You didn't do that very convincingly, Pat, so you're not going to get a point for that one.
It was always welcome.
I don't know. David, do you want to go first? Do you want to have a...
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think we want to talk about this. I would like more questions and less talk from the front. But, whatever we go.
Okay. For those who don't know me, I'm David Lee and I'm an architect. And I've worked with Pat for many years. This has been sprung on us completely. I mean, we hadn't prepared for this because we didn't know we were supposed to be giving a little talk like this. But there we are. We'll see how it goes.
Sorry, can I? If anybody can't hear, would they just kind of wave their hand? Because there is a microphone. You might have to just hold it in your hand.
Right. Can you hear now? Yes. Great. Okay. I just want to make 2 points, basically, and one is about land use and the other is about materials. I don't think that you can split the idea of shelter from the idea of settlement. I think it's a continuum. So I think settlement should have come in more with us, perhaps, than with transport. But never mind. Transport, of course, is important. But that all these things are connected in the end. But I don't want us to think that we just talk about shelter. We're talking about individual buildings, because the form of the settlement has a profound effect on the building typology. Obviously, land ownership is an absolutely key issue. How we get hold of the land to build what might be a more sustainable and beautiful environment. So I agree with Hugh Barton about that. It's an absolutely key point. My way into this world came through my education, and I was lucky enough to be at the beginning of the Centre for Land Use and Built Form Studies in Cambridge, which was really masterminded by a chap called Lionel March, who investigated the relationship between building form and building land use. And this was all part of the idea that academic education and theory should be related directly to practice. And it had a kind of decentralizing impetus, and it saw itself as part of the tradition of things like the garden cities. And the idea was to move from a really very urbanized present to a future which was more relaxed, more spread out. And Lionel did some very convincing diagrams and calculations about how this could be achieved in Britain, because people generally say, oh, there's not enough land, there's not enough land for all the people, we can't build enough houses, and anyway we'd wreck the countryside if we did. It's completely untrue. There's masses of land, and it just depends how it's done. One can develop communities along very small rural roads, sort of linear developments. One can develop cluster developments spread out, but quite closely related and separated by stretches of countryside. And of course this would mean that people would be brought much closer to land that they could actually grow things on in a more intensive way, because gardens and allotments are much more productive than agricultural land, as was shown after the last war. I don't think those figures have ever been disputed. So this sort of tradition of ideas about how to develop the land is really important. that is properly understood. Perimeter development, the idea of building in lines around the edges of sites. You can get really quite high densities with low-rise buildings if you keep the buildings to the edges of sites, and then you leave land in the centre which can be used for other purposes. I did a number of studies on this, and in fact one could take half the population out of the cities and redistribute them in the countryside. And then the cities would become much more livable places with bigger parks and bigger areas where food could be grown. We tested this practically at the London Borough of Merton, where we did a housing scheme, myself and Richard McCormack and Peter Bell, for 800 houses at densities which normally in the previous years involved using tower blocks and four-storey maisonette blocks. And we got everybody into houses with gardens and with integral garages, and left lots of play spaces for the children in three-storey houses. So land use and the pattern of land use and how you develop sites has a direct effect on height of buildings. And actually, if the land was used properly and communities, settlements were distributed properly, there would be very little need to build anything above 3 to 4 stories anywhere. Maybe 7 stories in the city, which is the sort of traditional building height for traditional cities. And this has an effect on the construction system. For instance, in 3 or 4 stories you don't need lifts, you don't need steel, you don't need concrete, so you can use low energy materials. Materials like earth, stone and plants. And that's what continues to interest Pat and me, is how we reduce what Peter Harper calls industrial, what's the word, Pat? Industrial goodies? Vitamins. Industrial vitamins. We reckon that we can build at the moment with 80% natural low energy materials and 20% industrial vitamins. Well, you can reduce those industrial vitamins, the steel, the glass, the high-tech materials which need a lot of heat to produce them, down to much less. And it's sort of ridiculous when people like Richard Rogers claims that they're building eco-buildings and they're all made of steel and glass. Ideally one would get down to the sort of earth brick building where just one material is used for the whole structure, the whole insulation, the whole finishes and everything, just earth. That would be a sort of ideal where it would be almost 100% natural materials, low energy materials. But we've done some experiments on using hemp lime as a result of the work at CAT on the Wise building there, where we used a lot of hemp lime, probably more than in any other building in Britain. It's a wonderful material, and it can give you structure, insulation, moisture control, and almost finishes as well. So that's sort of work in progress. And sorry?
No, that's a very quick question.
Yeah.
Very quick thing. What about 3D printing of houses? Because I thought they've been printing bungalows in China, 10 a day, using using renewable materials.
There's the Wiki House, isn't there? Which is,
I'm just thinking that's very relevant to what you're talking about.
Yeah. Is it?
Yeah. because you're using, because there's a shortage of housing, you can actually 3D print the houses very quickly. So you can actually get people into houses out of overcrowding a lot faster now using new processes.
I don't know.
Okay. It's been done in USA and Holland and Delft and in China.
What are the materials?
I don't know. They said renewable materials. But if you just look on the web, you'll see.
It's concrete.
Yes, some of it is.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Right, that's my lot. Thanks.
I don't know. I would like a microphone. Right, I'm Pat Borer. I'm also an architect. The collective noun of architects is a surfeit of architects. I went to work at CAT, actually got paid in 1976, which is when this book came out, so that's quite interesting. So mostly I'm going to kind of talk about the parallels, having quickly worked out what I'm talking about. In the army they say, tell them what you're going to talk about it, and tell them what you told them. So I'm going to do that. That way you remember. So I've lost my copy, so I had a quick flick through. The chapters, it's kind of a series of essays, really. And I think you're meant to, well, in books of that type, of that kind, if you do a series of essays and people skim through and read a bit, then you get a sort of, I believe the word is gestalt, an overview by picking up all these different things. I think that's how it works, because they are very disparate, the chapters. It starts with a little comment by Seitz Li Fang, who was the director of Decliner Arda, but then it goes into lightweight, low-cost mobile houses, one chapter, tree houses, inflatables, which were very fashionable at the time, shanty settlements, that's very good, very relevant, folk building, the ground over our heads, which curiously was all about earth building, but before the time we'd invented turf roofs, which obviously you now have to have for any green building, well, they're now called green roofs, and then self-help housing, so a funny little mixture of things. And then the bit on autonomy was quite relevant to us at CAT because it's got the thing in called the Brad roof, which is a trickle solar roof, water heating roof, which we then did. So Rob said a very useful thing, he does occasionally. All this is fine, the difficulty is the people, dealing with the people, and that's true whatever, when we're involved at CAT and self-build later. Actually, building is not hard. Sheltering people is very easy. All we want to keep dry and a bit warm, a nice little light, and a bit of delight. It's not difficult. And whether you print it or not, I don't think that's the problem, is churning out houses. Not at all. I think also you said it, or somebody said it's the land and the ownership of the land, planning. That's the problem. So at CAT, the difficulty dealing with people, there are a lot of difficult people, there's some brilliant people. Not geniuses, just brilliant people. Three of them in particular, there was Rod James, who was the director, who, they were all committed people, but in different ways. So Rod had a sort of vision of where to go. And then there were two other people who were sort of very ethically committed. Bob Todd, who was the technical director, Lord of the Wires, I think we called him, who was brilliant. And there's Jeremy Light, who was the biologist, and we called him the director of all living things. So between those three, they had an amazing drive which set the place up in 1976. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the projects then and where they led to or didn't lead to. There was a different approach. I think Peter's described it as energy is all at the time, so we weren't concerned what the buildings are made of particularly, and unfortunately that's still true today. It hasn't changed. People still get fascinated by energy and they don't care what they use to do it, which I think is wrong. But so there was a definite emphasis on low costs because we didn't have any money, simplicity and so on. And a feeling then, I'm not sure how that's changed over the years, is that you had to get this balance between personal change, because it's easy to live a low impact lifestyle if you are happy to live in a cave, or something, a be a hermit, and technological change. And the best things came from a combination of the two. People turning down the temperature a bit but having a very nice boiler, that sort of thing. So that was the approach, which I think still is correct. So the two things I just want to tell you about is that there were some very radical bits of technology for the time, which I'm quite proud to have been involved with. One was in 1976, the interseasonal space heating system, which was set up. So that was a building with lots of solar water heaters, never called them solar panels, solar water heaters, heating a big store which then could be heated up in the summer and heat the building in the winter. Crazy, everybody thought. So in fact, that was so cheaply done, it fell into disuse. But then you look across the water at Denmark, say, or Sweden, or Germany, even France. There are huge interseasonal solar heating systems run with, because they've got district heating, 60% of houses, district heating, and it makes total economic sense. So that idea, nothing to do with us really, but didn't get take up in the UK. In fact, there's a deliberate not wanting it to be taken up in the UK. If you look at the RHI, it only, Renewable Heat Incentive, will only pay for solar installations less than 200 kilowatts. So these things in Denmark are huge and they are enormous. So I'm very pleased that at least in one part of the world, in more enlightened bits of Europe, that idea of interseasonal space heating, because when you look to the future, what else have we got, is being carried on very well. The other, just to finish on, was the Waits House, where Rod persuaded Neil Waits of Waits Built Homes to build a conservation house whose only remit was to save as much energy as possible. And it's not a very nice house, but it works, which reminds me of passive houses. Well, in fact, on its measured co-heating test, it did achieve the equivalent of, if you put the numbers in, 10 kilowatt hours per metre a year. So it is, or was, a passive house in 1976. So I'm actually pleased that, the passive house movement has happened and made people aware that you can have extremely low energy buildings. So that's my little history of 1976. Thank you. Take my notes, such as they
are. Hi. I don't think I need the microphone. I don't know if you can't hear me, I'll use it. So my name's Stefan Szczelkun. I was kind of like in a bit of a parallel world in a way to the radical technology thing. I went to School of Architecture. I'm just going to give you a little prehistory very quickly. In Portsmouth in 1967, and quite quickly got disliked the kind of fact I was being trained to be a professional, and that meant that I was meant to, when I approached a building, somebody like a bricklayer or something like that, I was meant to pretend that I knew more about brickwork than them, and generally all the building trades I was meant to pretend that I knew a lot, and it made me feel very uncomfortable, that whole professional pretense. And then I started asking questions and saying in School of Architecture, well, what is architecture? What am I actually learning? What is shelter? And nobody could answer me very satisfactorily what shelter was. So I thought I'd just start to collect any information I could in sort of second-hand bookshops and old magazines or anything I could find. And so I made this collection of shelter, anything that had that association really. And then after doing that for a while, it got kind of quite interesting, because then I was looking through a photo album at my parents' house, and I came across a little picture of my mum, her mum and her mum standing outside of this old cottage. And when I asked about it, they said, oh yeah, that's Little Lunnon. That was when your great-granddad died, and the family of 10 had to move into this communally built earth house that was thatched in Lincolnshire. And I thought, it struck me this by the time I'd actually put this picture into the kind of, then I'd made these classifications, earth house section of survival scrapbook, I suddenly realised, wow, my near ancestors lived in a mud hut. I'd kind of grown up with a pink map of the world, and the people that lived in mud huts were sort of black people that you didn't think much of. Or there was all that kind of British Empire kind of stuff going on. So I thought that really made me think, and also the other thing I think probably from the same page in Survivor Scrapbook was this. I did a drawing of a picture which you just referred to really, of this idea that you could just dig down and pretty much anywhere in the British Isles, you could dig down and get the materials you needed to build a house. So you actually had on site, you had sort of like 80% of the materials to build at least the walls of a house. So these two things kind of played on my mind. By the time, so that Survival Scrapbook Shelter came out in '72 and was followed by Food and Energy. And then when I wrote a few pieces for the Radical Technology book, I was very interested. By then, I'd sort of discovered this thing, the shanty house, what I call the shanty house movement in Britain. It's actually called plotlands. Plotlands. Here's a particular thing about it, which I'll look at in a minute. So you can play the slideshow now. The plotland movement. Now, the more I learned about this, the more extraordinary it was that there was this huge movement from the 20s and 30s right through into the 60s, really sort of ended by the 1947 Planning Act, in which people, urban people, made dwellings for themselves, meant to be holiday homes, but were very quickly lived in as permanent houses, maybe 80% of the time. And and it's often nowadays self-build, which is kind of what I'm talking about really. It's often put down as well, self-build, it's all right for a sort of 2% of the population, but what about the rest, But actually this self-build, this UK plotlands movement, which was vast, it was all over, it was in Scotland, it was in Wales, this is in Gower, some examples in Gower. It was on the Thames estuary, it was on the East Coast, it was all over the place, and these things still exist. I think 80% of them still exist in some form or other. And this was not people building like from the ground up, learning to lay bricks or whatever, but it was more that people got hold of a pre-existing structure, sometimes quite quaintly a sort of a railway carriage or an old van or something like that, or a showman's wagon, but more often an old colonial kit house chalet that had a sort of veranda, and it had a very particular form, like 2 windows, a door, and a veranda kind of thing, and like I think 3 or 4 rooms behind. And this was a kit. So people were getting hold of these kits, which I presume were made to go out to the colonies. I've never done this bit of research. It's probably in the V&A quite nicely, but I've never done that. And that's a particular form there. You see, you got there again. It's the same one. So you get that's been filled in. The veranda has been filled in, but basically that's still the original form. So a lot of these things evolved from these, so people could go and live in them and then add to them. Now the thing was, they were often timber frame, very thin timber frame, very poor thermally actually. But because they were timber frame, people could easily just saw a hole in the wall and add another bit, add a bit on. So the whole thing could evolve. So the thing that was exciting to me was that they were colourful. They evolved these fantastic sort of forms, architectural forms, and then basically, even later I realised this was an urban vernacular in the making. But the kind of middle class planning and architectural community, and I particularly started to focus on Clough Williams-Ellis, the famous designer of Port Merion, started to attack these developments, this plotland movement, as an unsightly sort of blot on the landscape. They should be. This is awful stuff. These ramshackle places. They had all sorts of words for it. Should be wiped out basically, and I started realising and putting together this the idea that this thing that my ancestors used to live in this mud house and then this whole working class movement of self-housing, self-provision by urban people, often outside of towns, because that's where they could find a cheap land, a cheap plot to rent for a sort of £1 a year or something. It was very low rent. Because there were no services or anything like that. It was often in land that flooded I mean, these ones on the Gower, you know, that was before the Gower became an area of outstanding natural beauty, and you know, so that would have stopped that. But anyway, it shows the potential for people to self-provide houses, and it's the kind of rules and regulations around it that stop them doing. And I'm probably running out of time now. So anyway, I liked your survey of architects thing, because this is very much not getting architects out of the picture to an extent. Although the project I've done on the Gower, this photographic project I've done recently on the Gower, I've also done an interview with Owen Short, an architect friend of mine who's also at Portsmouth, who's actually kind of dealt with the planning authorities in relationship to upgrading these houses as people want to better specifications, better sort of energy performance and things like that. I wish I had a thing to stop this actually, but I haven't. Let me talk about particular things and they disappear. So this is something this is the kind of thing. I didn't carry on really with the whole survival scrapbook, radical technology sort of set of. I didn't try and whatever. We failed actually. We tried to set up an eco commune in Wales, and we failed, and then Kat took on that mantle and did very well. But that's one of the sort of threads from the survival scrapbook that I've followed through the years, is this study of UK plotlands, and through Flickr I've kind of I've got lots of pictures that other people have taken of plotlands to try, because my dream would be that there would be some sort of national study of this phenomena that had a kind of radical way look at it, you know, instead of it. And it's never been done, and like I said, it's absolutely vast. So I've been just collecting these pictures and taking pictures myself when I get the opportunity. So I'm going to publish this set of photographs with an interview with Owen Short, talking about how these places have adapted to new, more rigorous planning and building regulations and so on and so forth, and how they negotiate the planning laws. And I'll publish that as an ebook sometime in the future, sometime as soon as I can get it done. So, is that about my time?
Yeah. Sorry. We've got time for questions, because you've all been so incredibly good at sticking within your time. There, and there.
So I can do it loud. I just want to pick up this idea of plots as being a valuable one, because developers currently don't really think in terms of plots, they think in terms of estates. And the plot plan, which was written extensively by Colin Ward, of course, he was eulogising the sort of anarchic effect, the anarchic way in which they developed spontaneously through people's individual actions or family actions, rather than from some kind of pre-planned overview. But where they've actually occurred now, and if we were to try and repeat that, of course they're in rural settings, which compounds all the problems of accessibility, which we talked about in the last session. But if we convert that idea into towns, we can look at many cities, I'm thinking of Freiburg, Amsterdam and Copenhagen in Europe, where in quite high density developments, 40 to 50 to the hectare, they've identified a series of individual plots which different households can employ their own architect or design themselves and fit into some kind of terrace development. So you get a range of architectural styles, shall we say, within a common design code. So they all have to front at certain points and a maximum height, probably 4 stories or whatever. And that opens up the range of people who can get hold of plots to design and build their own place. Something which is difficult to achieve in this country, although we've got something called custom built now, which is being managed by the big developers again, so I'm a bit suspicious of it. that has a very long history. The idea of leasing or selling plots, individual plots, right back to the Bastille towns, for example, where every single house is different from its neighbour, but they all fit within a kind of a code. And they can be very dense indeed.
I mean, the big problem with it is the availability of land. You know, the developers have sewn it up. The big land builders.
This is why I come back to the idea of land.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, if you want a radical thing, it's basically say that if you don't build on it in 3 years, it's taken into public ownership.
I don't think land is the critical factor. I think the critical factor is classism. And we talked about, class war comics as one of the original images, but it's classism. It's the idea. I mean, the thing was that with vernacular architecture, people built their own houses. Basically, communities always had enough people with the right skills to build the houses that were needed, and that's still true. Working class people in Britain or anywhere else can build their own housing. That's the impediment. The idea that somehow they have to have housing provision. This whole thing of housing provision rather than enabling people to actually solve these problems. There's no intrinsic housing shortage or problem if people were allowed to build their own houses. That's my. And the land problem can be solved. That again is part of that whole thing. It's part of controlling things so that corporations can control all that and give housing provision rather than people can use architects as servants to give them designs and so on like that. I've got nothing against that, but make their own housing.
There was somebody over there who put their hand up earlier. Whoever that was.
Being that naughty 1% of the people in the room, being the farmer, in terms of the land supply, part of the big reason for the chalet development in the 20s, 30s was the agricultural depression. When you have an agricultural depression, you've got no money as a farmer, and you never want to sell land. So land became available because you needed the cash. I think that may be a significant driver. I'm not certain of that, but it seems that it kind of adds up in terms of the economics, is that you don't get rid of your land, but you will sell land if you need to.
It wasn't sold, it was rented, and it was always land that was very unproductive agriculturally, so you're right.
And then,
I don't know if people heard, but Danny Gordon was on the radio this morning talking about building on the Greenbelt and around the world, Greenbelts in general, but he specifically talked about Oxford. But his rationale was because the house prices are so high in Oxford, and this worries me because we're always told, we need to build more houses, but we've got thousands and thousands of empty houses already that could be used. And when you're saying about your ancestors, my ancestors were gypsies, and we had and still have really beautiful, perfectly good housing in caravans, but we're not allowed to live in caravans now. The whole thing is it's about corporate profit. It's not about meeting human needs. It's about profit now. And so I think, once again, there's a structural problem. There's a problem with the economy that we need to address.
Yes, I mean, these houses look very nice, but aren't they rather cold? And I was just wondering about the energy conservation measures that are built into them, or that have been added.
If they're not improved, they are very cold.
Yeah, mostly they're improved because they're owned by the people, and anybody who's sensible will insulate their houses if they can. They're also probably happier living at lower temperatures, perhaps.
And also because they're very small,
they're very
generally,
small.
they're easy.
No, I know somebody who lives there, and she's insulated her house, as you would. They're very easy to adapt because it just sticks.
Right, immediately behind there, yes.
I'm John Goodman. I was involved in radical technology and business science for people and radical science journal in the 70s, but then I went into the co-op movement, and it strikes me, and housing was one of my fields, it strikes me that things aren't quite as gloomy as is being presented. There is in fact quite a lively community-led housing movement at the moment. If you look under Facebook, if you look under community-led housing Facebook, you'll find a group with a lot of albeit fragments, but working together in an alliance, including the self-build housing movement, the co-housing movement, the community land trust movement. It certainly is an uphill struggle, partly because of land ownership issues and planning issues that have already been discussed, also because of the hegemony of the individual owner-occupier model. But I would say that with the, as we've heard recently, the decline in owner occupation and the growth of private rental, there is an opportunity at the moment to perhaps shift some of that momentum of that back again. The one thing I would say that has disappointed me about pick up Rob Hopkins' point about the people and the technology, is that the sort of the radical technology movement and the people organising movements have diverged, or have certainly gone along in parallel rather than converging amongst the community-led housing initiatives. There are only two that come immediately to mind. One is Lilac in Leeds, and the other is Forge Bank in Lancaster, which have embraced the sorts of issues around conservation and sustainability, low energy. Forge Bank is a Code 5 development, but it's the only one that we know of. And that really what we should be doing is trying to bring these two strands that have been in existence for about 40 years, that in their modern manifestation, perhaps bring them together a bit, and some of the connections that might make that happen could perhaps come out of this conference.
Good point, John. I worked on Forge Bank, and Forge Bank is a classic example of a volume builder who struggled to achieve the passive house standard, because that's what it was. But then afterwards, the social interaction between the people, which was mostly about an argument between the vegans and the vegetarians, and it's very factional still, but it's still a great place to live. But for example, they were going to have allotments, but in the end, the finances worked out. They had to build extra houses for sale to make the finances work. But you're right, the co-housing movement, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of people trying to develop co-housing. But the thing you have to remember, it's, again, relatively easy to do new build. Trying to do refurbishment, especially refurbishment co-housing, because of the, I've lived in co-housing, and you have to understand, because of the number of personal relationships, it's like, if you just own a house, you have a family, you have people you work with. If you're in a co-housing community, you have 25, 30 other people, you have individual relationships, and you've got to work together. It takes a lot of work. So in trying to do refurbishment in co-housing.
Yeah, well, nothing to
Right up in the back there.
Hello, I'm Jackie Carpenter. I live at Trelay Co-housing in Cornwall, which is a retrofit co-housing, and we've developed something which we think is really radical, and nobody knows about it. The academics haven't discovered us, and we haven't really really told them what we're doing. And so I won't tell you the correct numbers because it's too complicated, but we bought a place with 6 houses that had full residential planning permission. So say they all had 2 bedrooms each, then we could have, legally, we could have 12 couples living there. And so we could have 24 people living in these 6 houses. There's no law against sharing houses with your friends. So we've allocated a bed space to all the adults, and then we've built tiny houses like this in the curtilage of the dwellings within the permitted development rules for building a summer house. So if the planning inspector comes or the council house tax person comes, we say to them properly, and we've got certificates to prove it, this is my bed in this house. But actually, I never go in that house because I actually sleep and, hang out in a summer house. And if you legally live in a proper house, there's no law against sleeping in a tent somewhere. So I'm suggesting that people who live in caravans could do a deal with all the old age pensioners who've got spare bedrooms, get themselves, undercurrents sort of idea, get yourself a certificate to live in a proper house, then the authorities can recognise that you have a correct dwelling and you're living in a tiny house, and it's all within the law.
It's been done that the first single housing scheme did the same thing under permitted development because of quite generous guidelines. They had not other people, members of the same family actually, but it's a great
Well,
bit
we've
of
also
planning.
had to give up the personal control and ownership. So me, as one of the older people, I sold my house for £250,000. I put my £250,000 into a not-for-profit company that owns all the land and the buildings. The young couples that come along, they don't rent, they have ownership of the bit they have. They pay towards the mortgage. They're equal to the people who put cash in, and it's a partnership between old people with money and young people who may or may not have money. And by doing it, we're so much better off, but we don't need to involve solicitors and leases and not even architects, but we might do if we want to. It was you, yes.
No, I just wanted to ask a boring question. There's 40 years on, right? Each of you, just quickly off the top of your heads, you were saying about what rubbish buildings are being built now. What one or two things have you learned in your time which are absolutely essential to making better buildings now?
Break up the big builders and the land banks. I mean, I've spoken to local authorities, housing events, and said, if you're going to release land, 10 plots at a time, no more. You get 10 plots, you get a craft builder, someone who'll be called to account on quality. You build 50 plots, and the builder is interested in the programme, the accounts. They're not interested in quality, as long as they can sell it and not get sued. That's their requirement. That's all their requirement is.
I think find a really bomb-proof flat roofing material, which is low energy.
Mine is, apart from self-builders who are naturally inclined to build with quality, I only now use one or two builders who I can trust. That's what I've learned. And no tendering. No tendering. That's a terrible process.
I've got a
Yes.
Jan Voogd. I was wondering that, this is all very interesting, but if you look at housing from an energy perspective, and for me radical technology is, one of the parts is energy, what do you think of the new movement towards zero energy housing? And are there any examples in the United Kingdom? But, in our country, more than 95% of the housing is existing housing, and if you want to change that, you have to do a massive refurbishing of all the existing housing, otherwise you're never going to do that. That's my main question. The other one was, what do you think about tiny housing?
Well, I'm booked on the tiny house course at CAT next month, so I'm going to go and find out some more. I think it's a sensible use of resources. We do not need, by and large, we don't need the space we have. And if we're going to cope with a huge refugee influx, which I suspect we are, then having houses as big as we have is a luxury we can't afford. Because otherwise you'll be having to go back to what somebody said earlier, you're going to have sitting at your door with a machine gun keeping other people out.
Except that in the UK we already have the smallest houses in Europe per room. Our rooms are smaller than anywhere else if you divide the number of people into the square metre of the building. So I think we already do small houses. I'm not sure I want to go a lot smaller.
I would go on the small house thing. Go back to the lady over there who was talking about having gypsy ancestors, traveller ancestors. That one of the most outrageous kind of bits of legislation was, in Britain, was sort of largely unopposed, was trying to stop traveller lifestyles in the 1960s, then further legislations and further acts with local authorities. And I think that wasn't really opposed by the counterculture in any really powerful way. And it's just like, to me, it's sort of like Nazi Germany or something like that kind of attitude, just trying to wipe out the people and their culture by making them stay in one place. But it's sort of, they were small houses basically, weren't they? But they used the outside. The lifestyle, you know, so if you want a small house, there's a lifestyle and it depends on the climate and all sorts of outside spaces and things like that. So it's a complex thing. It's all very well to have a small house if you're living next to a beautiful south-facing bay or something like that, you know, and you can use the outside spaces.
Can you comment on my first question, the zero energy housing? No.
Well, people have talked a lot about passive house, which has become is that not it? I don't know.
Zero energy house is net.
But I mean, but the whole thing of I'm involved now, so I'm talking out terminally, but the whole thing of trying to retrofit sort of Edwardian housing. I live in an Edwardian terrace at the moment. Is very, very difficult problem, I think. With trying to retain some architectural character, not lose internal space, which is already minimal. It's a big problem. You can do the roofs and pick.
And not. I think with insulating, you have to be extremely careful about rot, basically.
Yeah. You've got to have ventilation.
Some people believe
you
should probably not insulate.
But just finish. But I think the thing there is like that. I would advocate that every south-facing roof needs to be collecting solar energy one way or the other. You know, it just needs to be legislation now, kind of thing. You know, like don't put it off. Don't want to campaign for 50 years for it. That's so urgent. And we've got a hell of a lot of roofs in Britain angled to the south already, and they just need to be. The tiles need to be stripped off, and they need to be, glazed, or they need to have, solar collectors put on them, like in an urgent manner, not just in this. Well, if you fancy, a little piecemeal thing. It needs to be a huge movement to turn every south-facing roof into an solar energy collector.
Yeah,
that would make a difference.
It just needs to be in the building regs. Put in solar water heaters. Stop. Because in Wales, for a brief period, every new house had to be code 3. And the cheapest way of doing that was putting in solar water heaters. So they did, without thinking about it. So if it's that easy, do it.
Good. Okay, can I just say one more thing? The subtext of a lot of things I've just said is that the politics level of it needs to be raised. We need to get up there, be much more militant with the politics level of it, because all these things like changing the building regulations, it's not going to happen unless there's a political movement behind it, unless we're informing a political movement that is like on the streets pretty much with that kind of demand. That's saying, wherever progressive political forces out there, this is what we want you to be asking for. Healing the Gypsy Acts and things like that.
But there's the anti-thinking that if there's no wind, you don't get any power. It's a negative attitude in Britain.
We've got in theory we've got 4 minutes left. I forgot to get Rob to do his bit.
Yes, right.
And also there's a few people who've been wanting to ask things for a while. So if we can shoot really quickly through those. So there was you and Patrick and over there. Somebody over there. Yes.
I'm David Saunders. I'm working with a build group in Hamilton House. And just to bring together a little bit about lilac and energy, lilac is a straw bale build, and the houses there are sequestering carbon, so you're already starting carbon negative. There's more carbon dioxide in the house than the houses weigh, because the houses are made out of cellulose synthesized from carbon dioxide. The average energy bill is £150 a year. The houses have got solar all over them. It's a co-housing unit, so communes have disappeared to be replaced by co-housing, but the big shift that people haven't noticed is that people are living together in workspaces, not housing. So you have a massive movement of community workspace hubs, of which Atmos will be just one of them when it comes together. So, wherever you sleep doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter if you sleep in a caravan or a bed. I'm living in 35 square meters at the moment, which is perfectly and can be built for less than £1,200 a square metre, times 35 is 4,200, divided by 3, you ought to be able to buy a house for 3 times less than your income. 4,200 divided by 3 is 14,000. Living wage is 15,000. So it's possible to build a house that you can live in on less than living wage right now, as long as you get the land for free through a community land trust, which councils are required to set aside land for self-build and co-housing groups. And this mayor in Bristol has already taken all his land off the market, although the last mayor does require him to build some houses at extremely high prices because we've got an arena to pay for. But watch this space, 800 homes a year should be being built on land that is not sold by the council. And small houses.
Could we move on?
And the community becomes the developer, so the profit goes into the community, not exiting through some kind of commercial, stuff is auctioned off for the maximum price. If you don't auction stuff, it stays in co-ops, community co-ops, at the build cost, which is how Lilac worked to build homes at a third off market price. Sorry, bit of a synthesis there.
Patrick?
Patrick Hannay, Touchstone Magazine in Architecture in Wales. I really don't like this dialectic that was set up at the beginning between the city as being ecologically efficient and the sort of autonomous, self-sufficient Arcadian house, William Morris thing. I think it's a completely false dialectic. We actually do in this country a terrible pendulum swing all the time between, Arcadia and the city. What about all the bits in between, villages, market towns, all the scales of settlement in between? And if you go to always start with Ebenezer Howard and Henry George's argument, and Henry George said, we're going to sort out the problem of our building, we need a land tax. Ebenezer said, you're never going to persuade the British politicians and public to accept a land tax. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find another way of financing and getting hold of land and building garden cities. And when everybody sees how beautiful the garden city is, then we'll see how awful the city is. Now, that's a fundamental thing. It's the land reform, and people keep saying it, it's fundamental. And the other one is going to Cat Zero Carbon Britain document, and the most stunning diagram is that one where they actually show what a tiny portion, people talk about concreting over Britain, what a tiny portion is actually built on. And what they absolutely radically say is you need to reform the farming movement so they get off this sheep and cattle, a terribly inefficient use of land. And then we recognise the refugee crisis, which keeps getting mentioned, and we recognise we have a problem with the elderly, all of us staying in our houses and living too long. It's a slight problem. And then we need to recognise that if you rethought our attitude to the countryside, you could have a whole load of different settlements being built. And we need to think about the rethinking of rural settlements, not the city.
I'm Lucy Cowan from Derby. Incidentally, my father lectured at the EDAC course, that's a long time ago. Three comments. Firstly, not just south-facing roofs. Until we've solved energy storage, we want east and west-facing roofs as well. Absolutely right about these more impact into politics and changing the minds of the policymakers. But finally, and it comes very nicely on to what the person just said, in terms of what we do with houses that need to change their shape, I think we really need to think about how we evolve. And if you're not in a co-housing project, how do we make that pair of semis into a larger house for a family and an apartment downstairs for the other person, and to make that flexibility? Or, model housing estates don't have corner shops. How do we build the corner shops things? All those sorts of things.
We've run out of time, sorry Rob.
No, it's run late.
Hey?
Rob.
Very quick.
Right.
You all right? I just had two very quick points to make. One of them was to pick up about the local materials. I'm in love with local materials, and they offer the potential for a whole economic resurgence, I think, and for rediscovering what we can do with those materials, local distinctiveness, vernacular styles, and so on. The main thing I just wanted to drop in was something that we talk about where I live, which is where something that didn't come up that much in this session was about what do you do when where you live you're faced with the kind of, I think you described it as crap or something, the kind of industrial flower pot housing, the sandcastle housing that goes up. What do we do when that goes on our doorsteps? There's neighbourhood planning processes that people are involved in, but actually what seems to be happening is people are putting loads of energy into that, while all around there's planning applications going in for rubbish housing all over the place. Where I live, we found that whenever we voiced any opposition to a rubbish application that was going in near us, we got called NIMBYs and got incredibly sort of felt deeply patronised by the term, and so came up with our own term, which was SWIMBYs, which was not that we want something, we want nothing, we want something wonderful in our backyard. And actually, there's a really powerful idea there, I think, about sort of, yes, it's important that we resist stuff, but actually it's also important that we come up with different proposals, and that's been something that's been really successful with us in terms of getting some development stopped, not by saying no, but saying actually that's just rubbish. Why would we settle for that? If I want to buy a new computer, I don't go out and buy some rubbishy old thing that runs on Windows 98. I want to get the best thing I can get for the money that I'm putting in. Why is it that if we suggest that we should settle for something better than we're offered, we get called NIMBYs? I think we should be proud to be called SWIMBYs and come up with something much better and make it happen in community ownership. Thank you very much.